Welcome to this talk. As it's said, we are working on different aspects of robotics, and one of the application areas, that's the one I'm focusing here today, is actually robots in agriculture. Something I started roughly 10 years ago when the EC started to put agriculture into the applications of the ICT calls. And it turned out to be quite fruitful path. Besides that, we're also working on self-driving cars and service robotics applications, but I'm more focusing here on robots in crop production. And you may ask yourself, why should you care about robots in crop production? And the reason is we as a society require a substantial amount of biomass, and that is produced mainly due to crop production. We need that to eat stuff, to feed the animals that we may eat afterwards, but also for other things that may not be very obvious to you, like putting a biofuel into our cars. A certain fraction of the fuel you put into your car actually stems from fields. So there's an increasing demand on producing high yields in crop production. Just as examples, if you look to 1 decade in biofuel production, it increased by nearly 100%, which is quite a lot, and therefore we see a lot of fields being growing crops which we do not eat, but we basically put into the tank, into our cars. The other thing, what's driving the need for more yield is the fact that we as a world population at least start to eat more meat. Why is eating more meat potentially a problem? The problem comes from the fact that if you look to the amount of land you need to produce a certain calorie from beef meat, for example, is around 10 times higher than the crop, because the beef needs to eat the crop and we eat parts of the beef. And this gives the ratio of approximately 1 to 10. And if you then see that we expect an increase in meat consumption worldwide, this actually multiplies quite a bit. At the same point in time, besides this demand for an increased yield, we see negative impacts of agriculture on our agro-ecosystems. So there's one study in even the protected areas in Germany where the study shows that over approximately 30 years, we lost 75% of the flying biomass, mainly insects. And this is an issue because we are reducing the biodiversity that we have, and the use of agrochemicals, especially herbicides, plays a substantial role in that. So crop production itself faces a lot of challenges today. We have the increased for a higher yield. We have limited amount of arable land. We cannot just simply extend that. We use a lot of agrochemicals, which has negative side effects on our agroecosystems. And also climate change is not making our life easier in terms of the stresses that the crops are actually exposed to. So a couple of years, we teamed up with a fairly large group at the University of Bonn and the Research Center in Jülich and applied for, very similar to what you gained here as the AI cluster, a cluster of excellence in the German system, trying to use novel technologies to improve crop production. And we are around 200 people by now, 50 faculties, trying to answer the question, basically, how can we reduce the negative impacts that crop production has on our agroecosystems, and at the same point in time, do not jeopardize the demand for a higher yield or even potentially increase the yield. So a lot of the activities focus around those questions. And we have different research areas in this cluster. One of them is related to developing robotics and machine learning technologies, so addressing this from a technical perspective, and that's also where I'm at home. But we also have people from plant sciences, from soil sciences, phenotyping, which try to understand the reaction of plant to certain stresses. Well, how can we optimize management capabilities? And also a large group of people looking into the thing on a larger scale, so how to build models of fields, of whole agroecosystem, and also how to bed that into economy. Because in the end, if we come up with new solutions, they will only be applied if they are economically viable, if you can earn money with it. Otherwise, farmers will have no interest in using these technologies. So I will only focus on a very small area of that, and basically staying here in this first area. How can we as roboticists support crop production? And that may be a question that you have. How the heck can we help using robotics to actually make a contribution to this? It actually turns out that there are two things that we can do using robotics technology, and that's something that we are used to do on a general basis. And these are the tasks of monitoring and what's often called intervention. So monitoring basically means we need to understand what's going on the field. So assessing the status quo. What grows where? Are there any pests? How is the weed pressure in our field? We can generate with our robots, with our drones or ground vehicles, relevant information that we can then provide farmers in order to make better decisions, or we use robots directly to do those decisions. And I will start in my talk in the area of monitoring, and we'll then later on come to the intervention part. And I pick out a very concrete example on how roboticists can help, and also embed that into quite recent work that we have done in order to overcome some of the challenges, especially in the monitoring part. So how to understand what's going on the field? The easiest way to do that is you buy a standard out-of-the-box drone, or at least whatever, DJI Phantom 4, a few years old, one of the first drones used now to make these cool YouTube videos, and you just point your camera downwards and you fly over your fields, and you take those images and analyze those images. And from a robotics perspective, then you can do two tasks with this. Geometric estimation, or SLAM, and that's something that Maurice talked about, so I kind of discarded that from my talk. And the second thing is semantic scene interpretation, so understanding what you're actually seeing there. So we can use a lot of the techniques that we used in robotics in order to perceive the environment, estimating semantics, identifying people in our camera images, and apply those technologies to crop fields. If we do that, what happens, we get images, like the one you see here on the left. You see a bit of soil, you see different plants in your camera images, and now you want to understand what you're actually seeing. So for every pixel, you want to say, okay, what we see here is the crop we grow in our fields. In this case, it's sugar beet plant, and these are the green pixels. Or there are background or soil pixels, stuff you're not interested in, that would be black here. Or this is red, that means it's a wheat plant. These are things you want to get rid of in your field, typically. So if we can extract this information, we can actually stitch those images together and then actually do an analysis. So this is an example of one of our first trials, flying over a field. And you can see this semantic classification being run on different areas. And if you zoom in a bit, I picked out 3 areas out of that image. Here on your right-hand side, you see everything looks good. You see green pixels. Everything looks fine in this area. No need to do anything. You have other areas where you see those pink spots, and those pink spots are wheat plants. So you see there's certainly a high wheat pressure in a certain area. Or you look to the lower area, I still see those green spots, but they seem to be smaller than the others. So the plants don't seem to evolve that well. So if you want to derive actions from that, it could be maybe we should fertilize at the bottom. In the top left, we should apply some herbicides. On the right-hand side, we don't need to do anything. And that's different to the conventional approach where you would drive over your field and spray herbicides everywhere. With those targeted interventions where you have, let's say, pixel-precise intervention actions, you can dramatically reduce the amount of agrochemicals that you need to maintain and manage your fields. And this is one of the approaches that we are taking. If we want to do that, we will run into challenges. So if we run that in our field in Bonn and we test it there, a few weeks later, everything will be perfect. That's an easy task. The problem comes into the game when we use that in different sites. So we train our systems in Bonn, we ship that to our partners in Göttingen or DHI Zurich, and they have different robots. Maybe we have a drone and they use ground vehicles. The data looks very different, and it's typically very hard to transform this data or those classifiers into new domains where the source domain and the target domain differ quite a bit. So from the perception side, there's basically these 2 challenges that we have: how to generalize well to still the same crop, the same type of field, but at a different sites, different types of whatever weeds grow there, different types of management techniques applied. And how can we do this, especially with small amounts of training data? Because one of the issues that we have is, if you look to the internet, there are a lot of images from cats and dogs that you can use and pull in order to train your classifiers. They have a much smaller number of images of whatever sugar beet plants or wheat plants. And also you need typically expert knowledge to tell the system that's actually a wheat plant and that's actually a plant we typically grow in our field. So you actually need students or agricultural students that we are hiring in large quantities in order to make those decisions to label your data. And that's time consuming, that's expensive, and we try to do a lot, try to optimize or embed background knowledge into those systems in order to succeed with a small amount of training data. From the action side, there are questions like, what's actually the right thing to do given we acquired that knowledge? And how do we execute actually the right thing that we identified? And we'll talk about those questions a bit, start with the perception part, and then also look into the actions. So first, let's start with generalizing and reducing the amount of training data that we need. What we typically have, we have a neural network, could be a standard CNN or something more advanced, where we feed in an image on the left-hand side. Then we have those layers which basically compress the data into some intermediate feature representation, and then based on this feature representation, perform this image labeling, so assigning to every pixel a color that represents a semantic class. And the key thing of neural networks is, which make them so powerful, but also have the tendency to overfit or to require large amounts of training data, that we jointly learn features and the classifier or the segmentation system in there. And that's different to the traditional machine learning algorithms like random forest that I started using in 2014 when we looked into those problems, where you as a user design features and let the system work on those features. So all the learning feature part was done by a human. If you have a huge amount of training data, you should let the system learn that. If you have small amounts of training data, maybe we should use our knowledge to do that. And the great thing of a random forest is basically the random forest tells you which features are good for making decisions and which one are not that good, because it's depending where they are in the tree of your features. So we started with saying, okay, let's not forget what we learned in the past. Let's use those features that have been helpful for random forest and bootstrap the network with that. So they are very simple features that you extract if you're in computer vision or image interpretation tasks, like doing Sobel operators or computing gradients in images or certain very basic features. You can actually compute that on your image and then turn your RGB, so a 3-channel image, into a whatever, 15, 16, 17-channel image, where you add those feature masks or feature maps as additional input channels. That's a little bit more costly, but it allows the network to reuse those features that we identified as being useful and start with them. Over time, it can improve those features, but you basically don't start from zero. And so we're changing the system of not having a 3-dimensional input image, but in this case, a 14-dimensional input image, and then learn that task. You need to change your network a bit, but actually not too much. And it turns out with this small trick, you can reduce the amount of training data that you need to the hundreds of the training data. So especially if you have little data, you're very effective. If you have huge amounts of training data, this effect kind of decays because the system will learn its own features which generalize well. And the other thing is good, you need less training data, and it also turns out it generalizes much better to new fields, where stuff looks a little bit different, but it basically uses the human intuition of designing those features to exploit that. And this was a starting point for funding the first company, PhenoInspect, which basically uses drone data and analyzes breeding plots for breeding companies. So breeding companies use those fields, as you see here, these are kind of small plots, and every of those small breeding plots grows a different variety, genetic variation of the plant. And the breeding companies are interested in identifying which of those varieties perform best. And this is typically done manually, so people walk into the field, count the number of plants in a certain area, count whatever, measure the leaf size and things like this. And we started to use drones to assess this data and analyze it automatically at large scale. So we can do this over large breeding plots. We just fly with a drone over it, collect training data, and then perform this analysis, and then say, okay, there are certain varieties which perform really well, and others perform worse. And this is done with simple techniques like semantic segmentation, identifying the stem location, emergence counts, how fast do plants evolve. This gives you early traits that the breeding companies are interested in. And we actually sell this as a service today to breeding companies in order to assess the performance of plants in the field. But you can also take that further and do things you would never do before, like ear counting in wheat, something that humans would typically not do. So you have a wheat field and you want to count all the ears, which gives you a pretty good prediction of the yield that you can expect at an early point in time. And this then allows farmers to make better decisions. So you can use this for tasks at scale that you weren't think you could do beforehand. And again, these are services which are now available through the company called PhenoInspect. That was one of the spin-offs from our lab. Philip Lottis, one of my PhD students, started that kind of 5 years ago from now. And this was kind of the first breakthrough that we had in building systems which generalize better to new environments. But we still suffered from generating a lot of labels. So we said, how can we simplify this labeling process? And one of the tricks that very recently brought us great success is using partial annotations. Annotating full images is very time consuming. It takes 20 minutes approximately to label all those images and identify what you see in those images. It is, however, easier to come up with partial annotations. So what I mean with partial annotations, it means just I label some parts of the image. I pick out some of the plants. I'm saying, okay, that's a sugar beet, that's a wheat, this is some soil pixels. I don't annotate the whole image. And also for instances, I want to do instance segmentation. That's an instance, but I don't annotate the rest. This is much easier to do because you get a larger variety of images that you can actually do just some partial annotations, or you can even automate that process in kind of semi-automated fashion. So things we can exploit, for example, a lot of the crops we're looking into are actually row crops, so they're planted in rows. Let's use this as an information which is relevant. The second thing, which we can typically do really well, is identify what's a plant and what's not a plant. The reason for this is there's a certain reflective pattern in the chlorophyll of the plant, which allows us to really well identify what's healthy vegetation, what's not. So it's a task we can do with 99.8% precision really well, fairly easy today. So we get those vegetation maps we can get easily, and we can exploit the knowledge that we typically have crop rows. So let's say a glorified half transform will actually give us those crop rows. And then we can use this to partially annotate our images. So let's say we take those plants, we identify the crop row, and then we cut out all the pixels which are not plants, so the blue ones over here, say that's soil and that's plant, we don't have any other annotations. So with those very subtle annotations, we want to try to learn a system because those annotations we can generate basically automatically. Still, you may have a user looking over it, but the speed of labeling is increased dramatically if you can deal with those partial annotations. And the question is how to exploit those partial annotations, because it's not that easy to do that, because you don't have the supervision signal for all these dark areas, and you just see a part of it. And then there's an interesting technique how you can embed background knowledge into those neural networks, again, to exploit things that we as humans see immediately, but the system itself doesn't know about. So the question is, how do we use this? And now I want to focus on the plant's instance segmentation task. So most networks that do today panoptic segmentation, that means semantic segmentation and instance segmentation, they basically have a network which has one encoder and two decoders. One does a semantic decoder, that's kind of the first decoder over here, which basically provides this label, what is what, and a second decoder, which is an instance decoder, which basically says, oh, this is plant number 1, this is plant number 2, this is plant number 3. And the question is, how can we exploit those partial annotations for those systems? And for that, let's briefly review how, let's say, whatever, 80% or 90% of those instance segmentation systems work. So the second decoder I'm looking into now. What they do basically, for every pixel in the image, they estimate a two-dimensional offset vector, which tells me where's the center of the instance where this pixel belongs to. So for this pixel over here, would say, that's the center of the plant, so shift this pixel over there, and then you will reach the center. That's basically what those systems learn. So they basically generate vectors in this image, or actually a vector field, in order to point to the center of the object. So if you draw one of those vector fields, you will see these are actually all vectors pointing to the center of that plant. So okay, that's a vector field. And what do we do with this vector field? So we have basically an XY shift vector in the image space. And what those systems basically do is they kind of, let's say, remove the background, then perform those shifts. So you will basically shift all those pixels to those locations. Then they do some outlier rejection and some smoothing, and then perform basically clustering, which gives you then the instances. So every color here is a different instance of the plant. That's how the majority of those systems will work. And that works great if you have fully annotated images. If you have only partially annotated images, you will get for some annotated parts, you will get those type of annotations which look good, but for other parts, you will get simply random vectors. And those random vectors typically screw up your system. When we looked at it, for you as a human, you can immediately see the result and say, oh, that's good or that's bad. Let's see what's good or a bad vector field. So this thing looks good. Everything points to a center. What's bad are vector fields which look like this, whatever, kind of this explosion, so the inverse of that, or circular things. And the question is, how can we embed that into the network? How can we add that knowledge, this kind of background knowledge, what instances typically look like, although we don't have annotations into the system? And that's good when you were uncertain on what you wanted to study. So I started with studying physics, and actually have a bachelor in physics, but I didn't pursue physics. But when I saw those things, I said, vector fields is something we did in physics in our first years. So the things which are vector fields, and the physics people have actually measures for describing vector fields. So you have things like divergence or curl, which are descriptors of vector fields. And you, for example, have things like a negative divergence basically points things to a center. Curl, which is positive or negative, means whatever, clockwise or anti-clockwise rotations. And the divergence and curl are basically computed based on the partial derivatives of those vectors in the vector field. And it turns out if you do the math, you can actually derive constraints that should hold for instances. And it turns out you want to have a divergence of -2. -2 is the dimension of the space we're looking into, and we are in the image domain, so it's 2, and it's negative because we want to have this inwards pointing, and a curl of 0. And we can add this as a background knowledge into our loss functions of our networks and says, if you don't know what to do, make sure you have a divergence of -2 and a curl of 0. And adding this background knowledge, we can still ensure that we have kind of okay-ish vector fields, even the areas where we don't have annotations. And it turns out that this gives you a substantial boost in the instance segmentation, and even on systems where you have quite some overlapping plans, you get pretty good predicted instances. And the nice thing is you can take those models learned in one environment, change it to a different environment with a different UAV at different growth stages, and you still have, like this one over here, and you still get really good instance segmentations. I'm sorry, the green of the projector doesn't look well, so actually these are different shades of green which actually give you different instances over here. And this was one of the next steps forward to get high-performance perception systems without requiring tens of students labeling for very extensive periods of time, and build systems which generalize well from one field to the other. And this is active research that we are doing in order to kind of boost the performance of those systems. So I give you a few insights from the semantic side how monitoring could look like. The question is now, once we have that information, what can we actually do with that? And we want to look to the intervention side. So what should we do if we have that information? And I want to look here again into the simplest management task on the field, which is typically the weeding task, but it's also the task where a lot of herbicides are used, which have quite negative impacts on our agroecosystems. So how is weeding done traditionally? There are basically two ways how to do that. Once you drive over your field and you use your herbicide and spray the whole field with your herbicide. That's the traditional conventional approach. Or you do organic farming, and then you have manual labor. So this is basically a tractor with a lot of people, and they're basically hand-picking or doing weeding in carrots in this example, and just picking out the wheat plants. Or you manually go over it and pick out the plants that shouldn't belong there. That's a very time-consuming process. That's pretty expensive and simply doesn't scale. We don't have enough workforce to do this on all our fields. So the question is now, how can we use robots or different, let's say, smart tractors in order to use the robotics technology that we developed, the perception system and action systems, in order to do weeding in a more ecologically friendly way. So going back to one of the first slides I started with, we have a camera image and we can label that. We can assign every pixel a color saying that's a good plant or that's a bad plant. So the next step is let's eliminate the red ones. So those things should actually die. And the easiest way to do this is selective spraying, or an easy way. So you just apply the herbicide with spot spraying just to those plants over here. And this typically leads you in a reduction of the herbicides in something in the order of 80%. So you only need 20% of the chemicals in order to operate your fields, which is a great win. And it's probably the first thing we see in the market, or actually on Agritechnica this year, one of the largest fairs, you saw companies actually offering these spot spraying systems already now. So this is one way to reduce this. We wanted to go a step further and say, can we do it completely free of chemicals? And that started with an European project coordinated by Roland Siegwart, the Flourish project in 2014. In 2016, we built the first weeding robot there together with Bosch, and it basically was, let's say, a glorified Bosch nail gun, which basically identified the weeds and then nailed the weeds back into the ground and just retracting the nail. So the device is used on construction sites for automatic nailing. We can use this in the field. This was the first robot which used this technology. So basically, these are kind of stamping system. So it was running the perception system, and this is a kind of a slow-mo. When you're over the plant, you basically have a stamping system which stamps the wheat back into the ground and kills the wheat with this. And when we saw that for the first time, that's awesome. That looks super cool, and you have the stamping mechanisms, and that's the way to go. It turned out, however, that this wasn't practical. These devices were breaking quite quickly after a week of operations. The other problem was you couldn't go very fast, and depending on how hard or soft the soil is, you were ruining the device quite quickly. So that was abandoned after maybe 1 year of operation, and said, that's not the way to go. And then we were kind of said, okay, what should we do? Should we do spot spraying? It was a bit of a downer during that project. In 2018, I had an old student which started as a master student in my Freiburg times, Julio Pastrana, 15 years back. He did his PhD, worked in industry, was bored, and then said, I want to go back to university, and I have the idea, I want to use high-power lasers to burn away weeds. Can we do that? I said, okay, let's give that a try. He joined the lab again, and then we did first experiments using high-power lasers to burn wheat plants. This was the first time we did that. At this time was a 6-watt laser, so it's still the size of one of those laser pointers, but more powerful, and you point it on the plant, and you can actually burn the plant with that. The thing is, you need to find the stem location quite precisely, and then you basically burn the stem location. If you just burn a leaf, the plant doesn't really care. If you burn the stem, this thing dies. That was the starting point, then also led to funding a startup, Escala Technologies, trying to commercialize this laser-based weeding. The problem, as you've seen here, that took very long. and was not the greatest starting point, but it took a couple of years to build a system. But in 2002, we built the first system which is operational, and in 22, and in 23, we now shipped the system to the US with Morningstar Company, a company who produces tomatoes for ketchup production in the US. And it's one of the largest tomato producers for ketchup. And this was a system we deployed last year. So you see those boxes here, which always host kind of 2 laser units in there. So these are kind of five laser systems. It basically has a camera, all the perception system, and then in this case, actually high power laser. So this is 500 watt per laser. And then a mirror system or a galvo, which redirects the laser beam onto the plants. And if you look into the box, this is what happens there. So with 500 watt lasers, you can operate much more quickly. You see the flashes popping up. You have around 20 milliseconds of exposure time you need to kill a weed. You're basically driving over the field and can kill the weeds in a very effective manner by just pointing the laser beam to those detections. And if the laser beam is powerful enough and you have reaction time of around 20 milliseconds, then also all the control problems get much easier because you just need to shoot once and you don't need to control the position of the don't need to correct where the laser beam is pointing to when you're burning those weeds. We are still at the level where we got safety approval recently. It still has some work safety issues because 500 watts is actually pretty powerful. You can actually burn metal with it also quite quickly. So it's a little bit not super safe yet. Still, at the moment, if you come close to the tractor shuts down with the safety system. That's still something we need to work on, but the system is now operational that we can run that on the field. We don't yet have the speed of going with whatever 50 kilometers per hour where we would love to be. It's more walking speed. So the driving speed still needs to be increased a bit, but we're quite confident that this is a system which is operational in real field conditions until you can actually sell that to every farmer. Probably will take a few years, but large-scale farmers can actually purchase the systems now. And this was just one example how you can use the robotics technology from the perception and the action side in order to contribute to more sustainable crop production. And I just talked about the easiest task here, which is basically weeding. Why is this the easiest task? Because based on your camera images, you can make the decision immediately what you want to maintain and what you want to kill on the field and just execute that. If you think about things like fertilization, it's much harder. If you see a brown leaf on a plant, it's not necessarily clear, is this whatever nitrogen deficiency or some other nutrient deficiency? Or if you want to fertilize, what's the weather forecast? Or other environmental factors that play a role. So you need background knowledge, you need models of your field in order to do fertilization and irrigation decisions better. Or even if you want to look into crop protection, so detecting plant diseases, when you see them with your eye, with your naked eye, it's typically too late and the spread is already there. So hyperspectral imaging allows you to detect certain diseases earlier, but they are hard to work with in the field under sunlight conditions. So there's still a lot of challenges that you need to address if you want to address the other key management tasks out there. And so we are still at an early stage, but we can already now, using the technology, make substantial contributions to that field. Which actually brings me to the end of my 30-minute slot, and I tried to give you examples how we can use robots to monitor our field environments and understand what's going on. A lot of the activities that we are doing is trying to do this in a robust manner, meaning it generalizes well to new environments, and trying to reduce the amount of training data that we need because it's expensive to label this and no one wants to label these huge amounts of data. And then trying to find ways on how can we build mechanisms to perform the tasks, the management tasks on the field. That in sum, I think, autonomous intelligence, you can call it robots or machines. Maybe it's not an autonomous robot, maybe it's just a smart trailer you pull behind your tractor, which actually does the majority of those tasks, but you could also run it on an autonomous robot, which use the technologies that we have developed in the robotics community over the last, 20, 30 years. And a lot of the kind of perception, geometric or semantic perception problems can make substantial contributions in that field. In order to change the way we produce crops towards a more sustainable crop production. And what I've presented here so far is just the idea of changing the current management ways of how to do weeding. But you can also take that a step further, and that's what we are trying to investigate over the next 7-8 years, is trying to really change the way you can produce crops. You can do things like combining different crops on the same field. You can take certain biological advantages of having different plants in the same field, but this requires precise sowing. It requires different treatments of the plants very selectively. It has challenges in the harvesting processes. But this is where robotics can make a big contribution, because you can do targeted, very specialized intervention tasks for the individual plants, one plant by plant. And this, I hope and I think, this will give us the potential to actually change also the crop production system, so the way we do farming today in the future. And I hope robotics technologies and the robotics community can make a contribution to that. With this, I say thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Cyrill, for this very interesting talk on perception, robotics, and the viewpoint from agricultural robotics. So we have time for several questions. Yes.
I have a very short question. How is much energy consumptive your laser technology? I mean, doesn't you spend more fuel than you actually have a benefits?
So right now we are having around 1,000 watt per box that we are using. I mean, the problem is you need to have high power lasers in order to have these short exposure times for killing the weed in a short amount of time. Especially the faster you go, the more power you need, but then of course also the exposure time gets shorter. But we are roughly now at 1,000 watts per box, at the whole box. It's quite a bit, and the other thing you actually need to do, especially if you're working in hotter climates, is actually temperature is an issue. So you need to cool those systems, because especially the laser diodes have a drop in performance or in efficiency if it gets too warm. So one of the investors of the company is actually a laser company from Berlin, which builds new generation of laser diodes, which are less sensitive to the heating issue. So we are not as much constrained as most other laser systems out there, but you still have a cooling system. This also takes quite some energy away. So if you have these 5 rows, you have 5,000 watts extra that you're needing. So that's the amount of energy you need to put in this. So clearly you need more energy, but I don't know how much fuel it is, for example, for a generator. At the moment, can't answer that. But it's approximately 1,000 watts for the whole box, for the computers, for the perception system, for the cooling, and for the laser together.
Other questions?
I really enjoyed your talk. It brought to mind some things that 30 years ago when they were looking at precision agriculture and computer vision side, there was some exploration of the work of fractals, that different plants have different patterns of growth, like that stem and leaf relationship. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you had looked at that. I really like the vector field approach, the divergence and curl, but have you thought about the fractals as a way of distinguishing or as for pre-annotation?
So what we are using, not in this approach, because the thing is here, we have this top-down view, and the top-down view makes it much easier to make those decisions, and kind of the vector fields is a very natural and fast way to embed this into the neural networks. You can do all the things basically with convolution, so it's a very efficient way to do that. If you want to do a 3D analysis of the plant, something I haven't talked about, we're actually using plant growth models for that as background knowledge into this. And this is kind of a full functional, structural, or architectural plant model where you really can simulate how the plants grow and try to combine that with the model information. So especially if you look into larger growing plants operating in glass houses where you often have occlusions. And you can actually use those plant growth models in order where you can actually simulate plants in order to estimate what is behind your occlusion and take that information into account. So we do that, but not for the weeding task here, because it simply, first, I don't know exactly that work, and it didn't feel necessary to go beyond those offset vectors. And the thing is, the offset vector is kind of the standard approach that we haven't developed, but which stems from the instance segmentation community. We running this as a kind of post-processing step on your networks. And we just saw those vector fields and says, okay, this divergence curl is a way to kind of embed our background knowledge into that. Generally, it turns out to be not too easy to integrate this background knowledge into those neural networks because they're basically a black box system, and we are trying to look into different ways on how we can embed relationships into those networks and train that, but it turns out it's not too trivial, especially if you want to do this in a computationally efficient way that you can still use all the training systems out there.
Hi, thanks. Really enjoyed your talk and I learned a lot. Thanks. So I'm wondering just how you see the farm of the future and where humans fit in. Do you see, the farmer being an operator of multiple robots, or one-to-one, one human operates one robot, or just generally how do you see the farm of the future?
Okay, so it probably depends on what you're growing. So there are still a lot of tasks which are hard to do by robots. So if you even think about picking delicate fruits like strawberries is one of those examples, which is a very hard task to do this fast and effectively without actually damaging the crop. So for those tasks, you probably will still have human workers doing that, but you can imagine robots supporting those people so that people actually focus on the task of the picking, but the robots, for example, do all the logistics. That's one of the approach that the people around Mark Hanhide and Greg Chelniak at the University of Lincoln in the UK are doing. They're basically trying to build those robotic fleets around the tasks that still need to be done by humans, or at least at the moment done by humans. And so certain tasks, especially in the harvesting context with delicate fruits, it's really hard to automate that. Other tasks like this broadfield agriculture that we have seen here, I think we will see more robots. The robots also have advantages that they are smaller and lightweight devices. And the problem is the larger the tractors get, the more soil compaction that you have, which is also dramatically impacting the quality of your soil and what you can grow. So having these fleets of small robots is an alternative way for addressing the problem. Still, you need to cover the fields at high performance in the same amount of overall time, but maybe you can do this with multiple small machines, which gives you a certain advantage also for soil compaction. Also, you can build small robots which can go underneath canopy. So especially for maize, for example, you have certain diseases that you only can see from underneath. So there have been people at the University of Illinois who are building small-scale robots which actually go under canopy and do a lot of the inspection stuff under canopy to find diseases earlier. This is a super interesting task that gives you completely new opportunities to do that. I still think that humans will be involved in the decision-making quite a bit of what management to execute at what point in time, because there's a lot of background knowledge that the farmer has, and you don't want to abandon that. But several tasks like doing this in a chemical-free way, the weeding, I think they will be automated. Well, I hope so, and I think so. Yeah.
Okay, just a last question.
Thanks a lot for your talk. Yeah, I was just wondering about the weed control. It seems you in your presentation, you made us to know, like, for the weeds, the laser strikes the weed and it dies off. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, are there instances in which, like, the technology kind of like misrepresents a plant as a weed, and what is your intuition around that? And also about the technology for killing the weeds based on laser. Will using technology as like a weed control system, I mean like a cutter, an appropriate replacement to reduce like the energy consumption and all of that? And also thinking about it, I think different crops are, depending on the kind of crop you're talking about, or fruit trees, the idea of how to segregate between plants and weeds can be different. For example, like if you talk about cocoa plantation, you have the fruit trees and you have the weeds on the floor. So, and it is much easier to demarcate between the weeds and the plants. So in those situations, what are your intuitions about them? Yeah.
Okay, so first question was, what happens if we mix up plants and weeds? Yes, it may happen. It may say that there's a sugar beet plant, we say, oh, that looks like a weed, let's kill it. That happens, but even if you look into the mechanical weeding, so the human error is in the amount of 3 to 4%, that you simply destroy a plant. So even if you kill a few, that doesn't really matter that much, or you're not worse than the human operator. Also, herbicides also impact the growth of your actually value crop. They're not completely unaffected by that. And so typically those systems, the accuracy you have is in the high 90%. So you're not that much worse than a human operator. So I think that's kind of okay. You may kill a few of your value crops, absolutely the case. Second question was, if there are certain weeds you can't really treat well. That is the case. So there are certain plants that you can't treat well with lasers, and this is if you don't have a stem. So kind of these grass-like weeds, which you can't really kill very well with a laser. So there are limitations. The third question was, I think, if there are other mechanical tools you could use except of the laser. Yes, they are, and even in the system that we are using, this is done. And so the problem is with those mechanical tools, you typically cannot go very close to your value crop. So what we are doing here, we basically have the crop rows where where the tomato plants were, and we are using the laser to kill the weeds in the surrounding. But outside the boxes, there's a mechanical tool which doesn't need to have high precision to basically kill all the vegetation which is out there. So this is already used. And the third example is if you have, the fourth question was if you have different types of plantations where, you know, whatever is growing at the very low, this is wheat. Yeah, that it makes it easier for you, and it may be easier to train your classification system, and you may be able to exploit that. Absolutely the case. Also here, depending on what plant you grow, you need different weeding strategies. So for example, for the sugar beets, typically 2 weeding rounds are sufficient because then the sugar beets have a canopy closure, so there's basically no light reaching the soil. So whatever weed was there and emerges newly basically doesn't get any sunlight exposure and is not being in strong competition with your plant. So it absolutely depends what you're growing, which type of management or weeding strategy you're actually executing. Did this answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.